Bona tarda. Vinga, doncs avui farem l'única conferència internacional que fem aquest any. Tenim a Marikit Taylor, que és historiadora de l'art. Potser alguns de vosaltres la coneixeu, però és una primera vegada que fa una conferència aquí amb nosaltres. Ella és suïssa, però ara viu a Helsinki i per tant coneix molt bé el modernisme d'allà. Per tant ens farà conferència sobre el modernisme de Helsinki. Doncs vinga, Marikit, please.
Thank you. Hello. So thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I can't see you at all, so I will imagine you. And yes, it's a great pleasure for me to be here to talk about Helsinki. I was here a couple of years ago talking about La Chaux-de-Fonds. As Jordi said, I'm a specialist in Swiss Art Nouveau originally. And then 7 years ago, I started studying Finnish Art Nouveau. And 4 years ago, I decided to move to Helsinki. And it's amazing, you know, when you're such an expert on one topic that's so small in one place, and then you go to a new place, and you realize that when it comes to Art Nouveau, the same movement can be so different and so special, and the story is so completely different and new that it's humbling. And I feel very grateful to have this experience, to have now these two sides of my knowledge. And I hope that this is something that I will be able to transmit tonight. And what I thought I would do is, first of all, I will talk a lot. And then, depending on how much time is left, the second part will be more like an imaginary walk through Helsinki so that I can introduce you to this beautiful city and its wonderful Art Nouveau. Especially as I think Helsinki Art Nouveau is not so famous internationally, so it's something that's completely different. And at least for me, it was like something very challenging and which was very enriching for my own personal experience. So here goes. So first of all, because you know, when I moved to Finland, I knew nothing much about the history of Finland. So just to make things a little bit simple with the most boring kind of picture, maps. So first of all, just so you know that Finland for a long time was not actually a country, didn't exist as an entity at all. It was part of the Swedish Empire, and it was part of the Swedish Empire for hundreds of years, and it was just kind of like the eastern part. So it didn't have any borders, didn't have any existence of its own, didn't have any sense of being. And then in 1809, suddenly, after years and years and years of skirmishes between the two kingdoms, Russia, the Kingdom of Russia, took over, and Finland became Russian. For the first time, in 1809, it was given borders. It was given limits. The idea of Finland emerged, but it was a grand duchy. So that's kind of how Russia attracted the Finns to be even part of Russia, was by saying, we will give you more autonomy. It doesn't mean that they had complete autonomy, but they had more. And the idea was that by letting them have more autonomy, the Finns would probably want to be part of the Russian Empire. And as we'll see, it's quite the contrary that happened. And finally, in 1917, after quite a long time, first it was very peaceful, and then at the end it got quite political and quite tense. And finally, in 1917, during the First World War, Finland kind of grabbed independence during the Russian Revolution and became an independent nation. So that's Finland. So we will be talking about Helsinki, which is down here. And just so you know, when I mention Karelia, because this is going to be a place in Finland that I'm going to talk about a lot. So Karelia is all the eastern part of Finland, but also part of Russia here, part of which was Finnish until the Second World War, which they lost a whole bit after the Second World War. But this is an area that we will be talking a lot about today. So just when I talk about Karelia, just imagine that area. So going back to the Swedish times, this will be important down the line, so you'll understand why. So when you think of Finland, because it was tiny tribes, tiny groups of people that were dispersed in this land that had no entity, no borders, The only thing that remains from that time is actually masonry buildings. So imagine that almost everything was made out of wood, so there's hardly anything that remains from the medieval times. And one of the only things that remain are these fortresses. Fortresses that the Swedes built when they were fighting against the Russians in this land that was always kind of the buffer zone between both kingdoms. So here we have the most famous one, which is Olavinlinna, which we will see even in the Art Nouveau of Helsinki. So remember this picture especially. But as you see, the other fundamental elements, they're made of granite. Granite, which is just everything in Finland is granite. When you cross the country, it's basically trees and granite, trees and granite. So granite is really, really inevitable in Finland, and these big, massive constructions. The other thing that remains are medieval churches. This also will be important later on, especially this kind of thing here in the gable. The decorations in the gable we will see again many times, so remember this kind of thing. So this will give you a good example when you see all the Art Nouveau buildings later on in Helsinki. Remember these medieval buildings. And the last thing I wanted to show you from this Swedish period was the frescoes inside. Again, kind of primitive frescoes. Of course, there were no great, the artistic knowledge at that time was still quite rudimentary, but there are some beautiful, beautiful churches full of frescoes, very much with this kind of, always with this kind of decoration in these colors. And the last thing is wooden churches. Here you have Petäjävesi, which is this gorgeous UNESCO heritage church. And again, this kind of motif. There's actually not much studying about the influence of wooden churches on Art Nouveau, but I do feel that there is probably something still to be researched there. So, after 1809, the Russian period starts. And the major thing that happens in 1809 is that, of course, because it was Swedish, there were so many links with Sweden, and the Russians wanted to cut this link with Sweden. So the first thing that Tsar did was change the capital. The capital city up till then was Turku, which was kind of in the middle of Finland, and suddenly he made Helsinki, which is much closer to St. Petersburg, the new capital. Helsinki at that time was a tiny, tiny, tiny village. There was a tiny town. There was a garrison island with the army, but the rest was non-existent. And so this is something that's also important for us, because what we know now is that it's called the empire style. So the Tsar gave money in 1820s, 1830s, 1840s to build up a masonry town from this tiny wooden town that was just what Helsinki had been up till then. So Art Nouveau will, of course, position itself in great contrast to all the neoclassical buildings that were built at this time, but it will happen a little bit later. So this is also something very important for the story, because in the 1830s, Elias Lönnrot was the first person who kind of went to Karelia. He went to the far remote areas of Finland to find the true Finnish identity and the true Finnish folklore. This is something that is going to just completely change and influence the whole rest of the history of the century, because Elias Lönnrot, first of all, these were Swedish-speaking people. You have to imagine everybody, all the bourgeois, all the administration was in Swedish. Finnish did not exist as a language, at least not as a common language. And it was part of the idea of becoming Finnish at some point that they would create not only a Finnish language that would be common to everybody, but they would also go and find out what is it to be Finnish. Because there's this very famous expression that one politician said is, well, we're no longer Swedish, we don't want to be Russian, so let us be Finns. The question is, what was it to be a Finn? And this is a question that will go through all the 19th century. And Lönnrot there was this idea that, in the south, in the east, in the west, society had already been influenced very much by Russian culture, by Swedish culture. So where could you find the true idea of Finnishness? And the idea was to go to the remotest areas, notably in Karelia, which is close to the Russian border, and find whatever was remaining that could still be tangible or intangible, because one of the most important things were the rune songs. There were all these folk oral poetry that was being transmitted from generation to generation. And Lönnrot is the first who wrote down these oral poems, and he created what would become the national epic, which is called the Kalevala. Kalevala, again, is a fundamental element that will then influence the evolution of Art Nouveau in Finland. So Kalevala is, it's kind of like a mixture of myths that he mixed together. He created one story. He was very clear that this was his interpretation, but actually a lot of the Finns said, finally, we have our true history. This is the beginning. This is our saga. And Kalevala, you know, it actually inspired Tolkien for Lord of the Rings, for example, so it's had a very big impact on the world. And again, it's something that we don't know too much about when you're not in Finland, but when you're in Finland, even today, many men's names, for example, or women's names, they come from the Kalevala. Companies have names from the Kalevala, so still today, it's very important. And this last thing to say is that Lönnrot wrote in Finnish. As I said, that was something very new. And then after that, they start trying to build Finnish literature, Finnish art, Finnish culture. So there's like this common idea that to finally gain the nationhood of Finnish, of Finland, the idea would be that because there was no political entity that had pre-existed, the language, the culture was going to be the one thing that could bring everybody together. So Kalevala in Art Nouveau is everywhere. So whether it's in applied arts, in painting, in architecture, has infiltrated everywhere. So these are some examples of tales from the Kalevala that have been transcribed into tapestries. Here you have The Felling of the Great Oak by Joseph Alanen, who did a whole series of tapestries with Kalevala themes. So here you have the story of the great oak that has blocked the sun and the light from the sun and the moon. And somebody needs to find the courage to break down this massive tree. And this tiny man comes and knocks it down and reveals the sun again to Kalevala. And here on the side, on the right, you have Axel Gallen Kalela. This is a major player in all of the late 19th century arts and theory and discussions about what it is to be Finnish in art as well. So we will be talking about Gallen Kalela a lot. And here he spent many, many months meticulously decorating Kalevala textbooks to create this beautiful, like medieval style. In French we say enluminure. I'm actually not sure what that is in English. Sorry, but you know how an old, like an old Bible almost. And here is Kullervo crying. Kullervo is a very angry man, and we will talk about Kullervo later. So that's why I put this picture. This Kalevala idea of going to the far remote areas to find the authentic Finnish culture, this became a thing. It was, it became part, because they couldn't openly fight against the Russians, they couldn't affirm any autonomy, they couldn't, politically rebel. Culture became the way to kind of create this cohesion, this idea of a new Finnish people. And so students, young students in the university were seen as kind of the vectors for creating this nationhood. So students went off into the wilderness to collect stories, these rune songs, to collect items, folklore, traditional elements, baskets, whatever, that they would bring back. And always talking about the rune songs, here you have some pictures of the intellectuals, the artists, the sculptors, the ethnographs, the teachers, the professors. They all went off on trips. And the idea was to get inspiration in the wilderness and take inspiration from the ancient culture that they could then put into their new art. So you have some pictures here from all these photos and memoirs and letters that were sent from these areas in Karelia. And for example, here you have one of the kantere players. The kantere is a very traditional instrument that they used to play while they sung these rune songs. And for example, Larin Paraske, who was one of the last people alive who still knew all these rune songs, they actually brought her to Helsinki so that she could tell them all and they could kind of study her. It was they were so passionate about it, and she had this knowledge, so everybody was trying to get a piece of her, so to speak. I also put these pictures to show that we're talking about Art Nouveau, But of course, this was also in art, not always Art Nouveau. This is sometimes very realistic, sometimes very figurative, sometimes very, very modern. Not always Art Nouveau. And so this was something that was going on just in this golden age that they call it now of Finnish art. Some items that I saw recently on a road trip, which make me think when I saw these in the museum in Kite. So Kite is very close to the Russian border in the east. So the old kanteles that were collected, the old spinning wheel elements, and of course this is so important in Finnish culture, birch bark. It doesn't appear so much in art maybe, but at least not in architecture. But birch bark elements, this idea of being a peasant, the peasant culture, the simple people, traditional people who spoke dialects and who lived simply and who hadn't been sort of contaminated by other cultures. And here, this launched a new trend. So this is the beginning of Art Nouveau. So you have all this going on, all these people going off to Karelia, coming back with their experiences and kind of living in communion with the forest and finding the original true Finn spirit. And Helsinki artists such as Galen Kalela decided that they wanted to go back to nature. It wasn't enough to be in Helsinki, which was becoming a city. They wanted to seek inspiration in the forest. Still today, Finns identify so much with the forest. Nature is where the Finns, it's their happy place. So Galen Kalela is one of the first who designed his own artist studio. We have this word for them, it's wilderness studio. And the idea was that they kind of took elements from this Karelia vernacular architecture, mixed it with some international elements that was very much the tendency at the time, and created sort of half traditional and half modern studios that they kind of retired to. And these are the first elements of Art Nouveau in Finland, even though this word that doesn't exactly exist at that time. And in his wilderness studio, you see he has very many objects that he'd collected. All these artists collected objects most of their lives. Most of them, as I said, went to Karelia, but many of them also traveled to Europe because that was also so important. This is the same in all the stories of Art Nouveau. You have the mixture of the folklore, the vernacular, but also the international, and it would be wrong to think that the international is not part of the story because it's very much part of it. The trick was to know how to tweak it and make it very local, very national, but still keeping it in this grand idea of this movement and this artistic happening that was going through Europe. Here you have Ad Astra, one of Galen Kalela's famous paintings. It represents, of course, Finland kind of emerging towards the sun from the water, with this idea that through difficulty you reach the stars. And he actually even used this as a kind of an altarpiece in his wilderness studio, and he baptized his children in front of this altar. And here you have the pictures of Kalela, which you can see are kind of very traditional looking, but also not exactly. This launched the trend, so I'm not going to go through the whole list. There's very many of them peppered around Finland, especially in the south. So this is close to Helsinki, so I consider this actually almost part of Helsinki. This is Lake Tuusula. So there was an artist colony on Lake Tuusula. So they kind of left the city where they wanted, again, to get inspiration. So you have very many famous architects and artists of the time, including Jean Sibelius. If you know this famous composer, we won't be talking about him today, but Jean Sibelius was very much part of this great movement to create this Finnish identity. So Pekka Halonen, one of the main painters of the time, he lived in Lake Tuusula, and you see his house again with this idea of the wooden structures, very simple, very rustic. But again, it's an artist studio, and there's very many elements that can be attached to other parts of Art Nouveau that developed in other countries, especially in the north and in the east. Robert Kajanus, who was a famous composer as well at the same time as Sibelius, he has this beautiful, and the gable with the projecting roof, that is something very Karelian. So again, you cannot say this is Karelian. It's reinterpretation in a kind of modern, idealistic, picturesque way. Sometimes it's mixed with Swiss chalet, sometimes it's mixed with Norwegian Drakkar buildings. You have all sorts of mixtures. And always this picture very important in all the elements we'll see, even in Helsinki, the stove. The stove is very important. Visavuori, which is closer to Tampere than to Helsinki, but still I think it's one of the nicest examples of this Karelian kind of influence. Emil Wikström, who was a sculptor, he built this in 1895 and it burnt down in 1896. So he had to rebuild completely. So this kind of is, I think, one of the only pictures. But today you can visit this gorgeous house. And he has his studio here, which has, again, some of these Karelian elements. And again, I'll repeat, it's not exactly Karelian, it's reinterpretation. But why is it so interesting as well? It's because inside you have all this kind of furniture. Furniture that's, if you go to Poland, if you go to Hungary, if you go to many sorts of, it goes up the north and down the Baltic states, and this Art Nouveau that developed in this region is completely different from the Art Nouveau that developed in France, in Belgium, in Spain, which is linked to completely other ideals somehow. So here again, reinterpretation of Karelian elements and the handicrafts. Urijo Blomstedt, who we'll speak a lot about because he was very much inspired by this, and he was very important in arts and crafts. So today you can actually go and see this is gorgeous, and here's another element he designed just to show you the style. So there is one word for this. It's actually more called National Romantic. National Romantic is a word kind of that we use in Finland. They use it also very much in Latvia. This National Romantic style, which has kind of these political undertones, but it's also idealized. And the definitions vary on what is the actual definition on the word. But I use the word Art Nouveau because I think National Romanticism is just part of Art Nouveau, but we could debate that. This was something I saw recently in an exhibition in Lusto, which is the forest museum. And it was this beautiful, and I'm showing it because it kind of immediately reminded me of these objects I saw in Kite. So you can see how they're not reproducing the motifs, they're just taking inspiration and giving it this very vernacular look. But it's supposed to appeal to a very modern, bourgeois, almost, inhabitant. And in Helsinki, we have some sort of more modern reinterpretations. These are summer villas that were built in Helsinki. So this is the Vuorio house by the famous company Gazelius, Lindgren, and Saarinen. We'll see more examples of this kind of architecture. So mostly in Helsinki, you have big city apartment buildings. You don't have many villas, and you don't have many summer villas, but there are some. And this is one of them. And of course, what's always important, not only these sort of pseudo-Karelian elements, but also the view. These are always, by the lake with the view. This is the dream. So today people have a mökki. The mökki is the summer cottage. You don't have so much a summer house anymore, but still the view on the lake is always the most important thing. This is the period so when we get to this Art Nouveau period, why does it somehow take all this importance with this idea of nationalism? It's something I'm going to talk about so much. It doesn't mean it's the only aspect of Finnish Art Nouveau, but it is definitely the most important one. Because after 1895, we get to what is called the period of Russification. So it means all this kind of autonomy, the peace, the kind of cohabitation that was existing between Russia and Finland came to an end, because suddenly the Russians kind of realized that they had left the scope for the Finns to become too independent, and the Finns were getting a little bit too, they felt that it was getting a bit dangerous for the empire. So they tried to whip them back into place, and they tried to start taking back all the freedoms, all the rights, and all the laws that Finland had benefited from since 1809. And this went very, very badly with the Finns. So actually the Finns, who had been quite peaceful, quite satisfied in general, being part of the empire, this was not going to fly, and suddenly they started mobilizing. So to say they were actually political and belligerent would be going too far, but there's definitely suddenly very political undercurrents that are happening at this time, and art becomes a weapon. It becomes, because you cannot overtly criticize. So art becomes a way to put hidden messages that only the Finns would understand. And here you have one of Axel Gallen-Kallela's stained glass windows, Rise Thyself Finland, a very important piece, though it is very tiny. And here you have the Finnish rose, which is rising from behind the forest like the sun rising after the darkness. So this is just to show you that everything, whether they wanted to or not, because that's the other side of the coin, sometimes the artists, they were so much part of this story that they got kind of stuck in it. And even if they didn't want to give a national message, people would automatically interpret it. And sometimes I'm worrying that's what we're doing again all these years later when we're talking about it, when we're analyzing it. It's hard to know, what was the desire of the artist. Sometimes, like in this case, of course, it's very obvious. But in other times, it's not so obvious, but we're always kind of imagining. And this is not Art Nouveau necessarily, but it's the same artists. But people, as I said, the Finns, they recognize these national symbols. So Lake Kaitele, which was, it's up in the kind of middle of Finland, representations of Lake Kaitele became, the Finns saw that and they knew what the message was. Same thing for all these lake pictures, the palokerki, the black fire woodpecker, another sign of Finnish nature. People saw these symbols and they knew exactly that these were subversive nationalist paintings. Or at least they imagined they were, but in the end it's kind of the same thing. And some of them were much more openly subversive. This is just to show you other types of things. This very famous painting here by Edvard Isto, which represents the Russian eagle attacking the Finnish maid and taking away her rights, because this is the period of Russification. And here stamps that are designed by Gallen-Kallela, black stamps. They are mourning stamps because they took away the rights for the Finnish postal system, so they had to go to the Russian system. They were no longer allowed to put Finnish stamps, so people printed these stamps and put them on the envelopes as an act of resistance. A turning point for Art Nouveau in general, and Finnish history as well, is the 1900 Exposition Universelle in Paris. This was the opportunity for the Finns. At this point, there was discussions going on. One of the most important discussions was, what is Finnish architecture? Still this discussion, never-ending discussion about what is Finnish identity, but at this point, they had got quite far in that discussion. And now the main point was finding a new style, their own style. The other thing was that the Finns no longer wanted to be seen as Russian. They wanted to, they wanted to make clear that they were independent, that they had their own identity. We're not talking yet about national independence as a state. That came later. It wasn't clear-cut like that. But we are definitely talking about a nationhood, an idea of a people who did not want to be taken over. And so they used Paris as a way to proclaim this independence, or at least hypothetical, maybe mythical independence in Paris, because this was an international stage. So they created the Finnish pavilion, which was hailed at the Paris 1900 exhibition is a very interesting exhibition because some say it's the heyday of Art Nouveau. This was the highest point. And other people say it was actually a missed rendezvous because the Art Nouveau actually in the end wasn't wasn't all-encompassing. So there's these two sides to the story. But all the critics of the time recognized the Finnish pavilion as one of the most new modern style Art Nouveau of the time. And what's very interesting for us is that what do we see? We see it has kind of elements of a church. Remember the medieval churches? So though it was made out of plaster, it was made to look like it was granite, because by now stone had become a vital element that people recognized as Finnish. It was also something used internationally. We'll talk about that more later. But the Finns used this as showing their own identity. And they've added all these very sort of elegant, decorative elements, which are inspired by Finnish nature, Finnish flora and Finnish fauna. As you know so well, that's all Art Nouveau movements tend to do. Inside, you see it looks like a church. This pavilion, I think, is fundamental because when you look at the pictures of Helsinki, when you walk through Helsinki, you can see everywhere that this pavilion, because it was so famous, it put these architects on the map. Because it was so famous, it also kind of gave a model for everything that was created afterwards. And again, they created this new identity, so they had to show that they were not Russian, but they couldn't kind of pretend that they were Western, because of course the culture was so different, and artistically they didn't have at all the same background, the same tradition, even the same knowledge. So the idea was, let's show ourselves as the people of the North. We are part of the West, but we are the North. So there's a lot of myth creating, and this is something I like very much because it shows you the spirit. So they had these two gates. So you see Section Russe, Pavillon Finlandais, Russian section, Finnish pavilion. But when they printed them in magazines, they erased Section Russe, Russian section, to just say Finnish pavilion. This is propaganda happening and statements happening, and the international scene in France, they were very receptive to this. You see articles in all the art journals saying the Finns with the brave Finns, the small nation, the small people, and they're affirming themselves. And now I'm changing the topic completely and going back a little bit to the handicrafts, but this does have a link with Paris 1900. Because one of the things that is considered to be the ultimate Finnish handicraft is the ryijy, one of the most terrible words when you see it like this, and once you get used to it, it's fine. So ryijy. So these are very traditional hand-knotted rugs that were used as wall hangings or as bed covers. So this is like a peasant element that was very common, hundreds of years of tradition. Most of them had kind of disappeared, from the oldest ones had disappeared. And so when they collected them, what they did is they took the patterns from the ryijy, reinterpreted them, as has happened in many other countries, especially again in Poland and Hungary, etc. So in this whole region, when you have a national identity to create, you take inspiration from old motifs. Here are some 19th century ones with this traditional spot design, and then you get to the modern version, the Art Nouveau version, this gorgeous ryijy by Väinö Blomstedt, but it was actually many women were making these ryijy because the idea was that they maybe had the knowledge, the ability to make this old-fashioned tradition. The idea was to reintroduce, preserve the folklore, the vernacular savoir-faire, but also make them modern. The idea was not to reproduce, like just copy. The idea was to take inspiration for that, to again show this lovely message. So here you have a very interesting picture, because this is the idea, it's called the sacrifice. And again, it's like going back to the churches. They were kind of going back to the period before any Swedish or any Russian domination. So there was this idea of the ancient Finn. What was the ancient Finn like before any kind of foreign influence? So here we think that this goes back to pagan traditions. So you see many elements of Finnish fir trees. You have this kind of smoke, which is very much like the coup de fouet, the whiplash line. So you can tell that's kind of this Art Nouveau. And here you have reindeer horns. So obviously he sacrificed also the reindeer, and very different elements. Here this knife, for example, is something that's very traditional. It's called a pukko, and it's like a hunter's knife. So these are elements that people recognized immediately as local, as national elements, that they thought were kind of scientifically based, but also, of course, many times they're also kind of imaginary because they didn't have the exact ethnological knowledge. So, for example, he's in front of some kind of totem pole that he's making this sacrifice to. This probably never existed in Finland, but it could also be some reinterpretation of the Karelian cross, which had all these ornate, intricate decorations. So there's always the combination of imaginary, fantasy, but trying to make it look historical. This is in the Musée d'Orsay, one of the new acquisitions from last year. So again, Väinö Blomstedt, and here you have some kind of rabbits and these beautiful chairs. And I like this picture very well. I like this element very much because I think that because it has been so long, unrecognized, this Finnish Art Nouveau, I think now actually it is getting to be more and more known. And I noticed, like, for example, at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, they are buying some elements that they still can find. So you can see that it is now, there's actually at the moment, there is an exhibition on Pekka Halonen, whose house we saw earlier in Paris. So this Finnish art and this Finnish architecture is now trickling down into the rest of Europe. This is the Ruiju that was designed by Axel Gallen-Kallela. Red flame Ruiju rug. This was for the 1900 pavilion. This is the one that they have in the Musée d'Orsay, which I saw there last year. And here you can see that same this is the 1900 pavilion, there it is, and the chair, which was exhibited recently in Helsinki, which is this chair here. So now we're going to talk about one of the fundamental influencers of the time. So this is the office of Herman Geselius and Eliel Saarinen and Armas Lindgren. So they created three young architects who had recently graduated and who opened their office. They became internationally famous because of the 1900 pavilion. So one of the only bunch of architects at the time who had kind of like a real international fame. And they were highly influential in all the Helsinki architecture that came afterwards. So first we're going to visit Vitresk. Vitresk is their wilderness office. There's the three men lived together, each had their own wing, and they had the studio in the middle. So you can visit Vitresk, it's about 20 minutes from Helsinki. It's part of the National Museum. And so though it has this idea of the wilderness, this is not the same as the wilderness studios that we saw before. This is definitely bourgeois living, very elegant, very big. The idea was also to have there all the artists of the time who would meet, and they had a kind of like a salon. So this was a very important place, but it was outside of the city, surrounded by beautiful views. And again, it's a combination of very local, national elements, but also you can see this kind of thing, the arts and crafts movement, which from England influenced so many elements in the rest of the world. Here you have again. So Vitresk means white lake in Swedish, and here you have the view of the lake. Again, this is inside Vitresk last year. Here you have the Ruiju. So you see they took the Ruiju, which was a very modest, very peasant element, and they made it into a very elegant and very refined and very strong message element to create. And what I like also is here you have, this is not so common in the buildings in Helsinki downtown, because these elements, Finnish architecture, most Finnish wooden architecture has planks. These are logs, and logs is the traditional wooden building of Karelia. So by putting logs and not planks, this is a direct reference to Karelia. So these are small signs, and I've been looking for this kind of signs because there are a couple of buildings in Helsinki that have these wooden rounded elements, but not so much. So this is something that kind of disappeared in the urban context, but it still stays in the outskirts of Helsinki. This is the old picture, so again you see the importance of the rugs, and again this idea of the hearth, the fireplace, the main room, which they call the tuppa. The tuppa is where the life happens in the traditional vernacular house, the peasant house. The tuppa was transposed to Art Nouveau, to urban living, and even in modernist architects like Alvar Aalto, who came much later, he still reinterpreted the tuppa. So the tuppa is considered like a very specific and important element of the Finnish household. And here, which is what I like very much, so you have National Romantic. So this is the sitting room, but of course you see how it's made to look like a church. And you'll notice these decorations here, and I'm not sure, are they going to remind you of the church frescoes, the medieval church frescoes? This is something that's not studied very much, but when I see them, I think it's just totally obvious, because here, for example, is Hattura Church from the medieval times, and here are the decorations from Vitresk. So as you see, they take the same elements, but they reinterpret them. At the same time, we're not talking about only Finnish elements because, as you know, this is also something that's happening in other countries. This is also a time of scientific advances. So, for example, they're starting to mass produce microscopes. So artists are fascinating by looking through the microscope and seeing, so close up, the tiny elements. So it could also just be that they're natural motifs, fauna and flora, Art Nouveau, we know this from everywhere else. Or is it a mixture of both? I'm pretty sure it's a mixture of both. But again, you have all this scope left for individual interpretation, not only from us 100 years later, but even the architects at the time. There was a lot of freedom. The whole point, remember, of Art Nouveau was to break with tradition, to no longer have classicism, to just go free, create new aesthetics. So this gave a lot of freedom to all the architects, despite that they had this global ideal. And of course, the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, which I'm sure we talk about every time we have a conference about Art Nouveau, the total work of art, outside, inside, furniture, decoration, everything should be harmonious, everything should be aesthetic, everything should be inspired by nature, should be handicraft. So you have the hand-worked metal here over the fireplace and this gorgeous thing to stoke the fire. And last element for Vitresk, this is also some what they put on the roofs of the medieval churches, and then they covered it with tar. That's why it's black. So some of the old churches still have this, and so here you have this kind of very, very local element, but also you can find this on shingle architecture in different countries. So again, imports from other countries, vernacular elements all mixed together. Very quickly, I'll show you Vittorp, which is in the same area as Vitresk, and this is just to show you the similar thing that the Saarinen were doing. And now we're going to talk about the industrial boom. So this is Helsinki downtown. So here, this is Katanajokka. This is really in the downtown area. I'm going to show you, this is initially how most neighborhoods in Helsinki would look. And this is back to the first picture. And if you look carefully, this area here, on the next photo, you'll see how at the end of the century, within about 15 years, maybe even 10 years, 600 or more Art Nouveau buildings came out just from nowhere. So check there, and if you see now, it's just changed within just 10 years. So this area is called Katanajokka. This is a very important area for Art Nouveau. So you have Art Nouveau neighborhoods in Helsinki because they all came up at the same time with industrialization, with bourgeoisie, with city living. And so this is something that, again, that explains why there's so much Art Nouveau and it's so harmonious. It's because it all was built at the same time. And sadly, in some cases, they knocked down all the wooden buildings and replaced them with these buildings. And the town just changed completely because for so long it stayed like the center around the cathedral and the wooden houses. And suddenly it became this city. This is one of the main buildings. So this is like an iconic building. It's called the Pohjolan Talo. So the building of Pohjola, which is Pohjola is one of the lands in the Kalevala. And it's actually an insurance building against fire. It was the first Finnish-speaking fire insurance company. And when I say Finnish-speaking, that means they're proud to be Finnish-speaking. They're no longer Swedish-speaking. This is the shift, in the cultural shift. And there was a design competition in 1899, and the criteria was that it had to be made of national stone. There's this huge debate, this huge importance of stone in Finnish architecture, Finnish Art Nouveau, because granite, which was so hard to work, they didn't have the knowledge, they didn't have the quarries, but granite, which was everywhere, was considered to be the epitome of Finnish material, the true material of Finland. So of course they decided that this was what they should build in. The thing is, because it was so hard to work and they didn't have the quarries, almost all of the buildings in Helsinki are actually made of brick, and then some of them have this cladding of granite on the facades to make it look like it's made of granite. So this is a spectacular building, very national romantic. Again, it's Lindgren, Saarinen, and Geselius who designed it, and here you find the ultimate national romantic elements inspired by fauna and flora, the bears, The bears, because it's an insurance against fire, so the bears are holding torches. And it's been counted on the building. There are 2 suns, 25 bears, 20 foxes, 17 eagles, 20 pine trees, and over 800 pine cones. So when you walk around the building, you're just kind of looking, and it's spectacular. And it's down in the center streets of Helsinki. And all these elements inspired from mythology. Is it Kalevala? Is it Nordic mythology? Is it imagination? Who knows? But you know, in Kalevala, it all takes place in the forest. There are all these magical influences. There's all this tradition in the north of believing in trolls and sprites and elves. So it's a little bit of everything mixed together that has been put. There's also some humor. This is Kullervo. That was an accident insurance, but you remember you saw the picture of Kullervo screaming on the painting earlier. So Pohjola with these gorgeous, very strange sculptures by Hilda Flodin, a female sculptress. So women, you know, were very advanced in Finland. Women were very much part of this debate. There were not so many of them, but there were quite a few still who were part of all this artistic and architectural debate on what was Finnish architecture. The entrance inside is just fabulous. It's all wood, this worked wood with these strange creatures, and you just think, you know, what is the mind that created these kind of decorations? The fern, these elements. So some of them would have very positive aspects, but some of them also reminded you of the darker sides of the forest, the little imps that could help you in life, but could also cause trouble for you. These are things that people believe in still today. Some people say that in the sauna, there is the sauna spirit. And again, because we're not only talking, you know, this idea is create a national style, but it's very well known that a lot of this was also influenced by Scottish architecture, which has lots of granite, and also especially American architecture from the 1880s, especially by Henry Robson Richardson. This is something that's been quite documented. So these ideas of taking the international patterns that were being reinterpreted around the world, making them your own, but with many Romanesque, these arches, we find a lot, the heavy cladding, the big stone, the big massive volumes. But this influence was very important, especially during this small period between 1895 and 1902, maybe. So you have a succession of buildings in Helsinki that are definitely inspired by this style. And then it will go out of favor. So you have like a couple of buildings, maybe 6 or 7, and then no more. So the National Theatre, Finnish speaking, very important. Finnish theatre was a way, again, of promoting the Finnish spirit. The very interesting telephone company building, which is totally modern building. Everything, the most high-tech things you could imagine for this new technology, but presented like this massive castle, like the medieval castles you saw before. And here Lars Zonk, the architect, he's no longer focusing on ornamentation as in the Pohjola building. He's focusing on textures, this very rough hewn granite. And he's also playing, which is not so common, on the colors. Here you have the red granite and the gray granite from Uusikaupunki. By now, at this point, Finland had developed a lot of granite quarries, so they were making huge advances in stone masonry knowledge. And this is what they're also showing here. And one thing I think is really fun is that he limited the ornamentation, but he did, instead of putting kind of like a fauna and flora, in the end, he decided to put things that looked like telephone wires. So you have stylized telephone wires here, different elements from technology, and even the weather vane, though it's a telephone wire, it looks like a telephone wire. So these are the small modern elements he put on this very massive castle-like facade. And what's also interesting is to think that we see these as very massive and inspired by medieval times, but this was considered completely modern back in the day. Here you have the Ottawa Book Publishers Office, same principle. And finally, the Pasitorni, which was the workers' house, which is a bit later, and again, this massive granite cladding. Now, one of the most beautiful buildings, which you'd never guess. So outside it's this very neoclassical building, and inside it's like this, because the neoclassical building was transformed in 1905 into a bank. And again, here the architect, Lars Zonk, who was the same designer as the telephone company, Lars Zonk just gave free range to his creativity. So here you have the bank as it was, and now it's a cafe. So you can visit this. It's one of these gorgeous interiors, and as you see, all kinds of elements. You have the decorations here, which are probably inspired from Viking elements. It's made to look more like a Norse hall. So it looks like a church, but it also may be like a Nordic prehistorical, pre-medieval assembly hall. And then you have, so here these dragons, very much inspired from the Draka style. The cats, anything to not be neoclassical. So apparently this is like a reinterpretation of the neoclassical lion. Why not put some angry cats? So you can go and have your coffee here between the cats. Birds, many birds, of course. Gorgeous, gorgeous granite. Some antique men. And the stairwell that goes to the other side of the bank, which is absolutely gorgeous. Most people don't know it's there. Some, again, references to other kinds of, maybe not prehistoric, but it's imaginary. You have some grotesque elements. There's a lot of humor. I think there's also some references to original pre-Christian, beginning early Christian symbols, which were considered to be, though it was not true, it was kind of considered to be before the Swedish influence, though it is the Swedes who, during the Swedish time, that they built the churches. And now we're going to start very quickly our walk through Helsinki. So we're going to start with Kasarmitori, which is one of the important squares near the center. So here you have it in 1898, and this is this summer. These important buildings here by Eliel Saarinen, and here in the middle you see it's not Art Nouveau at all. So of course I'm focusing on the Art Nouveau, but you mustn't think that everything is Art Nouveau, though there is a lot. There are still, of course, at the same time, historicist buildings, eclectic buildings, much neo-Gothic, much neo-Renaissance, but also there are plenty of very modern buildings because still, at this time, some wooden houses remained. So when you walk around Helsinki now, often you have all these old buildings and then suddenly there'll be these very modern buildings, and it's because for a long time a tiny wooden house survived and it was replaced in the 60s or 70s by a big modern block. So actually, when a lot of my friends in Helsinki, they often say, oh, but it's so ugly here. And I think, what are they talking about? But it's because they don't see these buildings. They only look at the ugly ones. Torilinna, I will talk more about this. I hope I can get to it, about the names. This is one of my favorite things. So many buildings in Helsinki have names. And I'm actually trying to start to study on the meaning of these names because it hasn't been studied much, and I'm sure there's a lot more behind these names than we know. So a lot of humor. This is not at all Art Nouveau, but you see, this is just reinterpretation, imagination, and of course the gables from the churches, which you will see all the time. No longer an Atlantis, a frog, and this little cocky bat there holding up the turret. This is just a walk through this area. So this is Kruununhaka. This is when I showed you the neighborhood that sprung up around the Orthodox Church. This is the gateway to Kruununhaka. This is a very harmonious, a very homogeneous Art Nouveau area. They all look, so you walk around and you feel like you're surrounded by these fairy tale castles. And of course, they don't necessarily have so much ornamentation, but what they do have is all these recesses, these plays, these turrets, these gables, and all the different shapes of the windows. This was completely new. No symmetry. It's not flat. There's all these different recesses and ins and outs with projections, re-inspirations of all the fortresses that we had to look at, elements inspired by churches. And again, it just becomes almost a standardized style at this point. This is Norma. This is a gorgeous building just opposite in Katanajokka. And what I want to show you here, the most bizarre design maybe you'll ever see. So what would you have on an old fortress that is supposed to make you think of the medieval times and maybe magic and black spirits. Oh. A rat king, something that apparently witches and strange people found in the medieval times, and it's unexplained why all these rats died together with their tails in a knot. And here you find it on a door in the middle of downtown Helsinki. Some beautiful stairwells. So unlike in Barcelona, for example, there are not so many, at least not so many preserved painted stairwells, but very beautiful elements in this exceptional building, which is also in Katanajokka. All the gorgeous, this is something very common. So many doors have so much of this beaten metal to make it look very rustic. You know, always this idea of rustic, it's of the land. We're not talking about refined elegance like in Brussels or in Paris. This is the north, so it has to be heavy. The Väinämöinen, who is the principal character of the Kalevala. So like Väinö, for example, is a very common man's name. So Väinämöinen that is also a barbarian word if you don't know how to read it. Väinämöinen, and he comes up on some buildings. I think this is one of the nicest examples. But for example, in art, he's painted all the time. The Väinämöinen's adventures are part of the local lore. Kataja, which means the juniper tree. This is one of my... So this looks like nothing. But it was not put there to be interpretation of nature, stylization as we know it. This actually has a hidden meaning. The juniper bush, which is very resistant, very resilient. It refers to the persistence of the Finnish people against Russification. So which are the elements that were put there on purpose? Which of them had hidden meanings? Which were just put there out of fantasy? Which were just put there because it was the trend? Difficult to know. But in this case, it does seem quite obvious. And I was talking to one of my friends about this element recently, and he reminded me, this is one of my favorite expressions because it's so Finnish. Jokkakuusen kurkuta sekatajan kapsahta. And it means whoever reaches for the spruce tree will stumble upon the juniper bush. And it's not reach for the moon and you will reach for the moon and you will end up in the stars. This is more, if you reach the pine tree, you're going to end up in the spiky juniper bush. And my friend thought that actually it's also a way of saying to the Russians, if you try and take too much of us, you're going to end up in the juniper bush. But of course, this is anecdotal. That's difficult to prove. A lobster, because you need a lobster sometimes. And this is, for example, a more traditional, maybe more coup de fouet. So not everything is inspired by bears and Finnish nature. These wonderful owls, which are crazy. Some of them are losing their eyes. The doors again. The Omega door, of course, we recognize this from most countries. But again, with this massive door frame to show the rock, the solid Finnish stone. This is one of my favorite. The owls, plenty of owls. This is a school, and here you see it's kind of a bit of a weird thing where they've added this extra bit with the granite, but the rest is plaster. And the gable, which is meant to look like a church again, or it could be from German influence as well. This is the Schallin building, one of my favorites as well, very rough, very rugged, very medieval, but full of decoration, full of ornamentation. The owner was blind, so it says that he wanted everything so that he could touch it, so because he couldn't see it. So he was very particular on the materials and the textures, and you can see it all throughout. This is my street, the end of my street, Harjula. Harju is a very common name, so this means like the house of Harju, but you see these pelicans. This is based on Kalevala, so I can't zoom in enough to show you, but each element has little decorations, birds, more bats. This is close to my place. Beautiful inside Boulevardi. This is more, again, this is more international. Boulevardi, which is one of the main boulevards. Again, you remember the Olavinlinna castle? This is obviously inspired by that. More castles, everywhere castles. At first I was just totally overwhelmed, and now I just walk. But still, you know, you look up and you see something everywhere. But I guess in Barcelona you're very used to that. These are some funny fish. This is a school, so of course the owl for knowledge. This I put because you see, because I am showing mainly national romantic buildings, but there are some with more international influences. So here you see maybe more of the Vienna Secession. There aren't so many, but there are some. So I guess most of them do have this fauna and flora inspired by the forest and the Kalevala, but there are some other elements. Oh, and what I like also is the name, Valo, which means light. Here more Vienna Secession style. This is in Kruununhaka, the bear. This is a Karelian sign, so it was built by Karelian students, but of course they're very proud of their Karelian roots. So they put it up there on their building. This is Vellamo. So Vellamo is the underwater kingdom in the Kalevala. So there's frogs that have obviously, they look like they've had too much to eat. And this is maybe the queen of Vellamo. Stylized typography, that's something very important as well. And voila, I've kind of got to the end of this little tour of Helsinki. This is the Villa Johanna. It's one of the few villas downtown in the center. This beautiful plan I found in the archives, and you'll see that this is not so much National Romantic, this is not so much Finnish style, this is definitely inspired by more European, let's say, maybe Vienna Secession and other styles. So Eira, this is a whole neighborhood that actually is built in a completely different way, very much inspired by the Jugendstil and the Vienna Secession. So this was created by Lars Zonk, the same architect as the telephone office. So you see how different it is. And this, I'd say, is a gorgeous area in Helsinki, but it is unique in its architecture. And I'd say it is not representative of Finnish Art Nouveau in general, but it does show, of course, that they knew full well what was going on in the rest of the world. One last example here of another one of these masonry buildings. And what I love is that you see, imagine how these buildings must have looked when everything was 1 or 2 story wooden houses, and then these massive buildings came up. And this is actually the old Polytechnicum. This is where the students, the school to become architects. So this building, which is so, again, archaic, was seen as the bastion of all modernity, the forward thinkers, the architects of the future. All those who were bringing this new style, they were all trained here. And this was a very important building. Now it's a hotel. So it's great because you can go in, so I cannot resist showing you. You'll recognize by now the church elements, the church decorations, but with flame inspired, the massive doors, the bears, which I love. And this is a sampo. So initially, the sampo is like this kind of evil spirit, almost representative of sickness. So not everything is happy and beautiful, but more church elements. The ballroom and cats. Not such a common element in Art Nouveau, but there are actually quite a few cats. But it also shows this quirky side, the humor. Not everything has to be taken seriously. But all things come to an end, and I'm also coming to an end soon. The railway station. I'm sure one of the most beautiful railway stations in the world. It's like there in the center. I go past it every day, and it's a pleasure to see. And initially, it was supposed to be designed in this kind of style. This is the National Museum. And Saarinen, Gazelius, and Lindgren won the competition, and this started the end of the story of Art Nouveau. Because when they won the competition with this kind of design, and here I'll just show you with this National Museum, you see the National Museum with the church, exactly the same kind of inspiration. Nothing is totally invented either. But they had this, suddenly with this old-fashioned, by now, people had decided we have had enough of this national romantic, enough bears. We've seen so many bears. And so you have Gustav Strengel and Sigurd Frosterus, who will suddenly publish a critique of this kind of architecture. And they'll say, enough. Now we need something new. It is no longer possible, especially for a railway station, which represents all modernity, all the future. You can no longer put bears and pine trees and pine cones and foxes. We need something new. And I would like to read an extract of what they published in 1904 against this kind of architecture. The use of archaistic forms, unless there are very strong grounds for doing so, is as absurd as wearing skins and eating with your fingers. The future architect has more to learn from the Atlantic steamer, the electric tram, from the racer and motorcar, from American office interiors and English lavatories than he does from art forms belonging to the past. The idea was now to do tabula rasa, start again from zero, break again with the past, and go on to what would be further down the line, certainly Art Deco. And so Saarinen changed the plans of the station, and this is what you have now. No more bears, but this very beautiful, very, very sober, no more ornamentation, as something that heralds now definitely a new era. This is the inside of the station. And so you do have, as a late phase of Art Nouveau in Helsinki, many, many buildings that are now very geometrical, completely different. Maybe less fascinating, but there are many of them. So if you walk around, you'll just see some more like this. And this is my final idea. Maybe you're wondering why, as a title, I put construction of a Finnish Shangri-La. This was maybe a bit cheeky of me to say this, but I do think there is something utopian. Of course, there's this idea of Finland creating its identity, emerging as a nation, as it would down the line. And at this period, you know that there is definitely something like everybody feels like they're contributing to something. There is this great movement to create culture. There's this great movement to create unity and to persevere against all the other countries that are maybe oppressing it, something that hasn't changed today at all. This is still what the Finns feel today. And you see this, in my opinion, in the names also of the buildings. Some of them have references to nature. Some of them have references to hope or to the future, like Phoenix. This is not something, of course, that's unique to Finland. We know that at this time, in many countries, there is references to success, the future, glory of technology, whatever. But I think in Finland, it does take on some more deeper level. And for example, here is the birch, koivu, birch, and I do love the typo, even the typographies are gorgeous. Tammi, which means the elm. It's kind of also this imagination still today that the Finns identify to nature. Nature is so much part of the culture. It's part of the Kalevala, but it's also part of the Finnish way of life. And then we go on to Jukkola. This is by my house, these are elements from the Kalevala, or elements from Finnish literature. So if you don't know this, you don't understand it. But Jukkola is in the first novel written in Finnish language, the first element of Finnish literature, fiction, written by Juhani Aho. They live in Jukkola. So if you see this name on a building, you know that this is a reference to Finnish, new Finnish culture. Here you have Mieliki. Mieliki, which does not want to come, is the name of a female character in the Kalevala. Here you have the swastika, which was a very ancient motif. Kointehti, morning star. I think these things have something utopian, maybe religious, maybe hope. Maya, the shack. You're calling your huge building a shack. Again, the dream of the Karelian or the small cottage by the lake. Kontu. Kontu is the Shire, you know, like in Lord of the Rings, where the happy people, where it's beautiful, where it's peaceful, where it's calm. Again, urban environments, but you're harking to another life. And also something utopian, I think, because many of these buildings were actually built by workers who didn't have so much money, but they got together and created associations and built themselves a better life thanks to pooling their resources and doing a lot themselves. Suvantula. This is when you have rapids. There are so many rapids in Finland where they used to float all the trees down. Suvantula is the calm area of the water where the rapids are. So it's like the safe haven. Again, this idea, utopia, peace. And my favorite, the last picture for today, Ihantola, one of my favorite buildings, not only because I think it's so gorgeous on the corner of a street in Kallio, which is a very working class area. It was built by an association of workers. It's got this gorgeous pink color. You see these gorgeous gables with these reinterpreted motifs which come from these reinterpretations of the medieval churches. And what does ihantola mean? Ihanne, ideal, the ideal house, the place of ideal. Kiitos. Merci. Thank you.